Welcome to episode 60 of Kontrarian Korner. I'm Ben Kellerin. Today we have a very special return guest on to talk with us about everything going on in the world, from the LA riots and what's going on there with immigration and domestic policy, and also what's going on with Israel, Iran, some of the bad takes floating around social media, some of the propaganda going around, all these different things that are very interesting to try and pick apart, and makes it an interesting time to be alive. But EM, thanks for coming back.
Thanks for having me, Ben. It's good to see you again. Last time we spoke, we were coming back from skiing.
Yeah, no, definitely had a good long conversation on the ride back from the mountain. But I think some of those things will have to stay private, but I'm sure we'll get into some of that, some of those topics here today. But I think it'll be interesting to kind of get into a wide variety of things. I wanted to start with the kind of current events in Iran and Israel, because I think you have a pretty interesting viewpoint as far as your military background, but also kind of the lens you view some of these current events through. And I wanted to kind of see, I guess I'll leave it kind of broad for you to open it up and we can see where it takes us. But what are your kind of view on Iran and Israel and how that's progressing, where you think it might go?
It's just a front in the color revolution that's playing out in the United States, right? It's late. We're in the late stage of a color revolution. And in the late stage of a color revolution, you have to discredit the government. And you have to call, this is estrogen-based warfare. This is how it works, right? This is how the estrogens work. They sow division and discord. They create vast amounts of false narratives that try to, bring you into their artificial reality that, now you're trapped in their artificial reality, trying to argue your way out of, an illusion, and vast numbers of illusions. But what they're doing is they're using Israel to strike Iran to force a crisis. And I've said for some months, there's a constitutional crisis coming sometime this month or next. I think it's within the next 2 weeks, as we're looking at the color revolution playbook play out. And there's others that pay way more attention to this kind of thing that are saying the same thing. But Israel's strike on Iran was to force a constitutional crisis in the United States, while sowing discord amongst the administration, between the people and the administration, it's to turn everybody on everybody, which is what you have to do when you move to whatever your next stage and step is going to be. They've been steadily losing in the courts for the last 100 some odd days, and really actually the last 4 years. So constitutionality is being restored in the courts. Judges are being highlighted for being just completely unconstitutional, completely not in accord with common law. So they're losing on that front. They were losing on the economic financial front. They were losing on the war. They already lost the war on Russia front. Popularity was high. So what do you have to do in the late, and it all ties into the LA riots, because that's all, you have to create the illusion of civil distress, widespread, massive civil unrest. The crazy thing is that they advertise for paid protesters for $500 to $1,500 a day on Craigslist. Like, people don't know Craigslist and don't look at Craigslist somehow, right? Like it's some private Discord or Slack server somewhere.
You got rent a protest.
Rent a protest, yeah. So, what we're seeing with Israel, Iran, I don't know exactly where it goes. I could get into that a little deeper if you want, where I think it goes. But the thing that we really need to look at is all of that is late stage color revolution, specifically to discredit Trump himself and then the administration, and then to sow discord amongst everybody that discord could be sown amongst. On the other side, and we've seen this in the color revolution, the Maidan color revolution. We saw it in Georgia. We've seen it in Romania. We've seen this happen. It's literally textbook, and people can go look at it, right? It's doctrinal, although it isn't quite a doctrine, but people who have studied this have laid out how these things happen. Why do we think we're somehow immune? We wrote the textbook, right? It's the thing that just dumbfounds me is two things right now. One, that people believe that Trump is somehow miraculously now bulletproof because he's president. They killed a president how many years ago? 60? They shot another one 40 years ago. They tried to shoot him months ago. So one, he's operating in an environment where he and his family's lives are in mortal danger. And anybody who thinks that he should just go be a martyr is a ludicrous idiot, because that would ensure that World War III happens. It would ensure that these things happen. So he's making decisions in a space with all these forces and all these elements and all these, conflicting, competing, all of this massive estrogen-based warfare. And that's not just women, right? That's elevated levels in males, but it's the way in which the estrogen molecule drives warfare, because it doesn't have the physicality, right? So it approaches warfare fundamentally different. So what we're seeing in Israel, Iran, is the late stage color revolution, where the next move, to discredit the administration, sow division, so that whatever the next event strike is here in the United States, they have the potential to possibly remove the president. It's also to try and force him into a position where he might make an unconstitutional move, right? A formally unconstitutional move. With respect to where Iran and Israel might go, I don't believe we're going to get World War III, the World War III that they want. And the reason we're not is because Iran is actually way stronger than people say. Russia and China are vastly stronger than the United States, individually and collectively, honestly, on force projection capacities and force logistics that are necessary to make that possible. And the United States and Europe could even hope to catch up for 10 years at least. And that's if they nationalized everything and had the leadership and management capabilities to go all in on war production. Like Russia and China would stop their production in that 10 years. So, I mean, it's just this ludicrous estrogen-based kind of thinking. So the empire is bankrupt. The empire has to pull back. This has happened throughout history. The empire has to pull back to the homeland, to the core, right? The core of the empire that it can actually defend with its stocks and its arms and its problems internally, et cetera, right? And it has to rebuild, and it has to clean house, and it has to get rid of all this, estrogen-based logic that's riddled through everything. This parasitism, we have to get rid of it. We have to let the enemies know, our competitors know that yes, we can still project force. We can still do real things. We can still really hurt you. We still have these capacities. At the same time as the empire pulls back, we've got a vast amount of munitions, a vast amount of equipment, a vast amount of covert and clandestine networks that are all well-funded, and infrastructure's in place. And you've got to burn all of that in local conflicts over there and highlight all these networks so they get, highlighted such that they get pieced apart and taken apart, so that all of that vestiges of empire out in the periphery can't be used to come at the core of the heart of the empire. So I think that's, one, the color revolution part's absolutely playing out, trying to cause all this division, et cetera. And the other part is, just like the Ukraine war has disarmed the empire and all of its stocks in Europe and across much of the world, because even South Korea was sending munitions, et cetera. So NATO's been disarmed. That's not a threat anytime soon. And now we've got the Middle East, that we've got a vast amount of, empire logistics and resources, and that's all got to get burned up. But it all has to be done in such a way it doesn't take us to World War III, because World War III is nuclear war, and it'll last 72 minutes.
Yeah, I think there's a whole lot of threads I could pull on there, but I guess the first one that I want to maybe not have some pushback, but I guess kind of ask a question just to clarify, because from what I totally agree with you. Europe and their military capacity is basically a joke. And Russia and China definitely have advantages in certain military capabilities, whether it's drones for China or just actual industrial production of stuff like artillery for Russia. But as far as like overall military capabilities, I guess the thing I think would be maybe some slight pushback is like overall military capacity from the US, I think is maybe not head and shoulders below Russia and China. Like, I'm not saying we can go win like a two-front war, like World War II or anything like that. But I think my big picture view is that we definitely should be pulling back, but the military capabilities are, I think, still mostly there, even if they are a shell of what they were 20 or 30 years ago, or at least relative to other countries.
We can't field one healthy combat division right now, much less an army.
Like specifically infantry or
infantry, all the support, combat support, et cetera. Direct combat support. We can't field a healthy division right now. What we have to understand is that this whole color revolution stuff and those behind it have been steadily working to weaken the United States for the last 40 years. I was in during the Obama purges of the military leadership. I was there. I was in special forces at the time. I was in combat in Afghanistan, doing work elsewhere, and it was just being gutted. Their own people put in, and then their whole wokest things happened, right? Whole lot of other things that I won't communicate publicly. We are not capable of fielding one healthy frontline combat division. Now, the other piece is that we are not the military since the 1970s, and really starting the 1960s, is not designed for peer-on-peer conflict. It's designed for basically as support for SOCOM, as evidenced by Afghanistan and Iraq, where we spent 12 years in Iraq and lost, and we spent 20 years in Afghanistan and lost. We spent 20 years in Vietnam and lost. Now, in the estrogen-based world and thinking, they don't think about winning the same way that testosterone does, right? Testosterone is you crush your enemy, like World War II. You destroy their production capabilities, etc. Estrogens don't think that way. For estrogens, it's just that's a conflict, and we'll get that, however that goes, it goes, and we'll make a bunch of money off of it.
And it's halfway around the world. It's not on our front doorstep.
It's halfway around the world, and we'll just go on to the next conflict, because for estrogens, it's an eternal war, right? It's the total war, the forever war that people talk about. So we are, as a fighting force, we are not designed for peer-on-peer sustained conflict, as we've seen in Ukraine. And you want another prime example of how much we know in the bowels of the Pentagon that our equipment and gear, our high-tech, technologically superior stuff is inefficient, as we didn't use air power in Ukraine. Why? Because we didn't want to be losing aircraft every day. Quite literally, right? We are a maritime power. We come out of the English, the English, the British Isles. We are a maritime power. The extension of maritime power is air power. If the illusion of our air power and thereby sea power is pierced, we're a paper dragon. Right? Like, I've seen this meme with this giant F-35 and the people and all that, they throw it down an F-35. I'm going to tell you, that meme and how it's getting pushed around and just kind of the algo push, et cetera, tells me that there were at least one F-35 shot down. And that's being used as a way to, in this estrogen kind of psyop way to, diminish that. Probably more than one.
Interesting. The I guess that's a good kind of segue into some of the stuff you've talked about on other podcasts and now brought it up here, is kind of the, like, what happens when you have society and politics and culture dominated by women and weak men and old men. Like that's why I think like when I look at what people say about, oh, support for the Democratic Republic is declining and people are just wanting a dictatorship or a monarchy or whatever, which I think is where we're headed eventually anyway. But the way I kind of look at it is, if you have the current system, which is basically ruled by old people, women, minorities, like retards, pedophiles, like go down the list of all the people that like you don't want in power, then why would anyone really continue to support like a democracy? So I think that was kind of a long rambling way to ask, but what do you see as far as kind of impact of having a society dominated by women, how it flows through to politics, culture, the military, like you were just saying? But what do you kind of see as the impacts there?
It ended Sparta. I mean, there's historical antecedents for this. It destroyed Athens. It destroyed Sparta. It's, gutted the empires of Europe, right? Those are all matrilineal lines. Yes, there's a man here, 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 but look at the women, look at their wealth, look at their heredity, right? Look at their unbroken matrilineal lines, etc. It destroyed Europe, impoverished Europe, and impoverished the British, the English. I hate that term British, but everybody knows it, so we'll use it, right? It gutted and impoverished the British Empire. It's been doing that steadily to the United States, since World War One, really, the period of World War One, so right around the, late 1800s, early 1900s. So it's not, when I say estrogens, that's men and women with elevated levels of estrogen, unhealthy. That's not it. I don't mean women, and when I say testosterones, I don't mean just men. There are healthy women, healthy, matriarchal, strong, capable women as well. It's just, when I say estrogens, testosterones, it's the way in which neurologically they think, they process, how they wage conflict, right? Or how they approach and address conflict. When you have an estrogen-based system, it's a parasitic system at every level. It is an abusive system at every level, everywhere. And it ultimately collapses because it runs up against it runs up against hard resource limitations. It runs up against the requirement to be able to actually do really complicated things over long periods of time, which emotion-based thinking is not capable of, consensus-based thinking is not capable of. And at some point, it winds up devolving into exactly what we're seeing, failed narco states. You have to have strong masculine testosterone, systems and structures in place to protect, to secure, to build, to manage. Now, that's what's happened in Russia. It's returned. The Soviets were an estrogen system. Maoist China was an estrogen system. It destroyed them, killed tens of millions, maybe 70 to 90 million in Russia. That's not even including the 29 million lost in World War II. 29 million people. Russia lost 29 million. All told, we lost somewhere, including the Germans, somewhere around 6-7 million. Right? Russia, after Soviet Union, put testosterone, the testosterone's back in power, men and women. China's done the same. Persia did the same in the 1970s and, into the 1980s. That's why they have to be taken down, right? Because they work, they function. And they're willing to, they have learned that you can't let the bitch come at you with a knife and a gun and just let her stab and shoot you because you can't hit a woman or an estrogen, because that's just not right. Bitch, you come at me with a gun or a knife, I'm going to knock you out if I don't shoot you in the face. I'm done with this shit. right? And again, this isn't about women, right? That's not what I'm saying. It's about this unhealthy estrogen system, which every myth system and the Bible talk about at length, right? So it's not like I'm, and then the neuroscience demonstrates it, estrogen upregulates for violence, testosterone downregulates for violence. Testosterone makes the individual physically more capable and logically more capable of violence, but downregulates it. Why? Because we are more capable of violence. And if I pick a fight with somebody and I didn't do all the calculus right, I might get seriously injured or killed. The estrogens don't have that regulation to downregulate for violence because they have the smaller physicality. They don't have the war fighting logic, the fighting logic, except for these crazy women in the MMA. Most all of them are lesbians, so that brings up all kinds of questions. Anyways, right? They're not all, but most of them or many of them. But the point being is that estrogens don't have, and this is in the males as well, right? The males with higher levels of estrogen, they don't have that natural testosterone. Wait, hold on. I'm picking a fight that might not go so well for me. Let me do the complicated calculus to see if I should proceed. They don't have it. Men do, healthy testosterone men, and women, healthy women who are still women and still estrogen-based systems, but healthy women that realize there's got to be a balance between the two, because sometimes, and I've seen it, I've quite literally seen this as a bouncer, right, in some pretty big places. I've seen the difference between the estrogens, a male and female couple, when she gets out of hand and she just pushes and then he gets involved and he pushes and then shit goes down. And then I've seen other times where the testosterone's a male and female pair, right, or group, and she gets drunk and she gets angry, probably because somebody actually did something, unlike the first pair, and she gets angry and pushes, and then one of the males will step up to her and talk to her and calm her down and say, hey, and it works out, right? Because she knows if he comes and he says, hey, we probably need to calm down, she trusts him. She trusts that that's the logic, that he is a male if he's healthy, right? And he's assessed that and he's like, yeah, we're not going to do this, right? This is going to get her hurt, and I don't want her to get hurt. That's the difference between, and now scale that up to societies, right? Scale that up to nations, scale that up to civilizations. That's the difference. The estrogens have no check or balance on their rage and wrath. The testosterones do.
Yeah, I think it is interesting. I was just pulling up a quote from a podcast I was listening to from a guy named Charles Spadil. I've been trying to get him on my podcast here soon, but he basically said, to your point on the civilizational collapses in the past when like things get out of hand, he basically, here's the quote, I'll just read it. There's a reason every civilization ever goes through the same cycle and collapses. And it's not a coincidence that anthropologists secretly use one metric to measure the decline of a civilization, and that is how much power women have. The more they have, the closer you are to the end, which I think it's good that you kind of clarify that, like, the men that don't have like the healthy levels of testosterone, the logic and all that capability, like that plays a part too. But I think when you see some of the stuff going on, it's just enough to drive people nuts, because it's like all this stuff, it won't be an easy fix, but most of it's a pretty simple fix where it's like, okay, you want to like stop provoking foreign conflicts, then maybe we should stop funding like some of these different regimes all over the place to like stir things up. And if you want to deal with LA riots, maybe we should deal with the like deportations and 50 to 80 to 100 million people that shouldn't be here, right? And like, I'm not saying that's easy, but it's simple. So I think it'd be a good place to shift to talk about kind of the, like you mentioned, color revolution a couple times, and like some of the LA riot stuff, some of the stuff going on there basically stinks to high heaven of NGO involvement. I think, was it the mayor of LA, Karen Bass, was worked at like National Endowment for Democracy or something, And so you have all these different like signposts where.
Oh, she was involved in some of the color revolutions in Europe, by the way. Just saying.
Yeah. So basically, all these signposts point to some of these things being rent-a-protests and totally contrived. But what's your big picture view on if this is going to be like another summer of George, like summer of George fentanyl, like type deal where you have like chaos, protests, and kind of broad, like mass scale unrest that is basically looks made up for the most part, but that doesn't mean there won't be chaos in certain parts of the country.
Well, if this plays out as it's already playing out, the next stage is broad spectrum civil unrest and violence. And the way that estrogens work is they will push you to where there is no option for you but to punch the bitch in the face or shoot her, right? And then they use that against you. You hit a woman, you hit an estrogen, a weaker male, you're tyrant, et cetera, et cetera. So everything that's been happening over the last 100 some odd days, since the inauguration and really before, and things that have been set up, because again, what was all this stuff that was coming out of the previous administration about Trump proofing the next 4 years? The hell do people think that was? Right? So everything that we're seeing is late stage color revolution, which they have to do. I don't know. We have a major election coming up next year, right? The midterms. And so timing wise, I don't know if they're just trying to set conditions for wins, or if they think they can steal a bunch of things and then fundamentally change Congress. And it's not just about the federal, by the way, people. You're going to stop freaking paying attention to the federal. Really doesn't matter. It's all the local elections that matter. That's how Karen Bass got in. That's how these DAs get in, these prosecutors get in, these sheriffs, these chiefs of police, all kinds of other people we don't even know who the hell they are, right? Judges, right? This is how they get into power. That's where real power is. It's not in the federal government. It can only do what it can do, and it can't enforce what it needs to do without support at the local level, as we see in LA, right? As we're seeing with the counter ICE movements and deportations, et cetera. People really need to pay attention to the local, and those local elections do come up in the midterms, right? So I don't know if they're trying to set up, the steal for the 2026 elections, or if they're afraid of what's going to happen in the 2026 elections because they can't steal it, because how the hell did Trump get back in office when they appointed somebody and had so that means there was a massive amount of voter fraud that was countered in very sophisticated ways all over the country, and I'm going to applaud people for that, right? So maybe they're afraid of 2026, where it may go even more against them at the local levels, right? If that's the case, so if they're setting up for 2026 election, we could just see a steady escalation of discrediting and sowing discord in the Republican Party, in the MAGA movement, against it, within the members of the administration, et cetera. And in state, the correlation to that also at the state level, right? State and lower levels. If they're concerned about the 2026 election, then they have to go for the coup, the final, violent removal of, or the fleeing of, the executive and members of the administration before 2026 elections.
Yeah, interesting. The other thing I was thinking about too, when you were talking about the elections, and even if you look out past 2026, one of the things I think is pretty interesting is when they do the census, I think in 2030, the way the representatives are divvied up, it includes the population that's here illegally. So if Trump and company, Stephen Miller and Tom Homan, guys like that, can like get their house in order and get to 10 million, 20 million, 30 million, 50 million, like People severely underestimate how many people need to be removed from the country.
We're probably, realistically, going back the last 20 years, we are, and I've seen numbers on this, folks that have done it through various models, we're probably closer to 80 million illegals in this country.
Yeah, I've heard 80 to 100, and that's wouldn't surprise me at all. And so if you do the math on what happens to a state like California, like obviously Texas and other places would also lose. And I'm not sure if this is something where they could just rewrite the rules on who gets counted in the census, but there would be, I think, some massive changes in, okay, California is not just a massive weight in like what they have, like 55 representatives at the federal level. And I think it would be interesting to see.
Well, it's also the number of judges, because judges get a portion based off the workload, the caseload. And if you have, and this is also why they're upping the crime rates in blue states, because that gives them more judges, and the judges give them more power. The judiciary, right? Because then the judiciary can rule against anything that comes out of the the federal level executive, or even states levels. So they increase the amount of criminality and violence and destruction, et cetera, in their states, while with the influx, because that, aside from the congressional, the real power is actually in the number of judges that you have, because they're the ones that are doing the final final ruling on whatever the legislatures. Honestly, legislatures don't have any real power. We all focus on them, and that's being done unintentionally, because where the real power, the ultimate final say is the judiciary. And so for every, yes, I think it's 740,000 people, homeless, illegals. I've written on this before. You get another representative in Congress, but you might get 2 judges because of the caseload. Texas has picked up, I can't remember what it is, 13 additional judges in the southern part of Texas because of this. California has picked up 40 or 50. So that's, and that's where these judges are coming with this unconstitutional, non-common law rulings, where they're doing these basically fatwas for the whole frickin' country for things that have nothing to do with them, because it's, it doesn't adhere to habeas corpus, because whatever the hell they're ruling on didn't happen in their state, or the individuals involved in the case aren't in their state, but they're doing these national injunctions. Well, that's not constitutional, and it's getting smacked down by the Supreme Court. The problem is the Supreme Court can only do so much work, and all you need to do, which is what's happening, is overload the Supreme Court with unconstitutional rulings that only the Supreme Court can undo, or Congress. But Congress won't, because Congress wants more people, right? More representatives, because that's more money flows. It's not power. They have more ability to flow money through their own hands and back to their state. So we are rapidly approaching, within the next couple of weeks, a hard constitutional crisis. Israel and Iran's all about it. The discrediting and tearing asunder of the MAGA movement and the administration, and I'm listening to genuine men, mostly men that I respect, right? Men that have done real things in the world, but they have all, to some form or fashion, got Trump derangement syndrome. And not a single one ever articulates the environment he's operating in, the forces, the conflicts he's dealing with. They all act like he could be a total and absolute tyrant and make all this go away. And but not get shot, or have one of his grandkids fucking sold into slavery or shot. That single one of them takes any of that into account when they're talking, like Scott Ritter and Johnson and all these other, Luongo and all these other people who I genuinely respect. But the world that they, it blows my mind that they don't take into account the environment that man is and his cabinet, et cetera, are functioning in. The threats, it's like they just shot him months ago, right? So constitutional crisis is rapidly occurring, rapidly happening, and they're playing it out at every level. Back to your question, what comes next in the color revolution, depending on exactly how this goes and how it plays out. And again, you can't know exactly because we might prevail, right? How do we prevail in this color revolution? Don't let them tear us apart. Stop being disloyal to the Constitution, the country, and its leadership. It's what they want. They're counting on your Trump derangement syndrome, and right. And it's, anyways, back to the judges and the apportionment, right? So one of the constitutional things that we're going to have to deal with, because we are going to have what's going to come out of this crisis, this, Strauss and Howe saeculum cycle, and out of this 400-year great English cycle, is we are going to have some actual constitutional amendments. We're going to have to go back and revisit the 14th. We're going to have to revisit the 19th. We're going to have to go back, and some people way smarter than me, like Barnes and others, have commented, Robert Barnes, et cetera, have commented on this. But we are going to have to go back and plug some holes, the very holes that they used to create and set up this color revolution and this total estrogens takeover, et cetera. And that's okay. We got to survive, though, to that point. And we need to not let them tear us apart. But the constitutional crisis has already happened. It just hasn't come to its culmination stage yet.
Yeah. So I guess the follow-up question is, you seem confident that it's like basically here, coming very quickly. Like, what does that look like? How does it play out? Like, is it some courtroom back and forth? Is it
that's already happening? Watch Robert Gouvea's channel. He does the best job of anybody I've seen on what's happening in the courts, and it's happening rapidly. Tommy Kerrigan and I did a show some months ago about Grok as a legal constitutional lawyer, right? Constitutional super AI. The court stuff's already happening, and they're losing there, but they're overwhelming the system. They're overwhelming the Supreme Court. They're causing divisions there, and this is how estrogens work, right? They're constant sowing of division, and overwhelming you with shit you got to deal with, and forcing everybody into artificial realities. So, that's all working through. The stuff in the courts is actually going the way of the Constitution. Forget Trump, forget the DOJ. They're engaged in it, but it's going the way of the Constitution. And that's solid, right? That's a solid sign. They haven't been able to force Trump and his cabinet and his people into unconstitutional actions, which is one of the major pieces around Israel and Iran, because that's another. Okay, so we've got the apportionment issue in the 14th. It's constitutional crisis we're going to have to deal with. We also have the war, the who can declare wars, and what is the definition of a war constitutionally that we're going to have to deal with, because Congress, we've been in all kinds of wars for the last 80 years, and Congress hasn't declared war under the Constitution since World War II. So that's another problem we got to fix to get to what you were articulating earlier, right? About why do we have all these wars? Why do we have all this covert clandestine shit around the world, all of which is unconstitutional? So that's another one of these things we're going to have to deal with once the constitutional crisis has come to its full head. And if the color revolution fails on the other side, sometime after 2026 probably, we're going to have to set to and do some constitutional amendments. And those two are the two right off the top of my head that we definitely got to get to.
Yeah. So I think that's pretty interesting to talk a little bit about what comes on the other side of it, if we can kind of hold it together basically until then, because you obviously have, is it 2/3 majority to get rid of an amendment? Yeah. And there's some stuff in there that I think would be pretty interesting to take a look at, whether it's stuff like the income tax, stuff like the 19th Amendment, which I think is the obvious first target, because a lot of this stuff flows from and the societal decay stuff. Like people always say like, oh, you don't think women should vote? I'm like, well, do you think if just men voted, we would have kids being mutilated?
Not generally mutilated.
Yeah, If
We
it was
would
just
kill
men
those
voting,
motherfuckers.
yeah,
Literally kill them.
those people deserve to
Be generally
d-
mutilated themselves and then left to bleed out.
deserve a rough ending. I think is definitely. I'm in the same boat there. So I think it is interesting because I think more and more people are waking up to some of these things that need to happen, and I think the generational change is going to be a part of it, and that's maybe an interesting detour to go into where like you have a lot of people have talked about like what happens as the boomers start to decline in number and pass on, and all these different things like different attitudes towards well, there's different attitudes towards Israel or like current events, some of these different things. I think younger generations, especially on like the male side, are not interested in like participating in the system as it's currently set up, just because there's no um, like the American dream with home, family, white picket fence doesn't seem like a attainable goal for most people under 30. But I think it is interesting to kind of think about. Do you have any thoughts on how the shift in generations can change how all this stuff plays out?
Yeah, so great question. And you and I have certainly talked this driving back and forth to go skiing and over cigars one time. I'm not sure we came to any answers that I could articulate better now, but I actually have immense, as I've said before to you personally, I have immense confidence in your generation and the younger. Millennials are interesting. They've been shat on their whole life, blamed for everything their whole life, and they were shaped for, from the time they were young for a world that was gone. It was already gone, and now they're in this, very, very difficult place because they're conditioned for a world that's gone and not for the world that's coming, right? Which is kind of a return to the older world. But they'll get through. I have confidence in millennials as well. As an overall generation, but Gen Z, your generation, and you're just some years older than my daughter. I'm watching things, having a 16-year-old daughter, getting soon to be 17, and then having her friends over the house and the boyfriend and all of that. They grew up on phone, they grew up with all this brain rot and all this stuff, all this woke stuff and all of this, estrogens, reality stuff, and they're the boys and the girls are turning it off. They're not completely walking away from their phones. There's still dopamine addictions. We've got to deal with that, but the content they're watching is different. The things that they're engaging with are different. The conversations I've just heard in the last 3 years have changed. There's been a fundamental shift in that generation, and they're going back to classical roles.
If I could jump in too, I think the fundamental change, the shift you're mentioning over the last 3 years, I think there's like a giant gap or like dividing line, like pre-COVID and post-COVID.
Yes.
Where like that was a giant shift, especially for anyone that didn't already have a family and kids, where it's like, if you had a family and kids and it's like, oh, I get to work from home now, great. If you're like younger generation, like still in school, like early career, like,
and you get locked
remote
in your house for 2 years, it's like, why do I want to be loyal to that system?
Yeah, like why would I participate with this company? And like going back to like my public accounting days, they were all like wondering why they couldn't keep like men in the firm for like more than a year. And all the like new hires that had been signing on since 2020 were like massive attrition rates. And it's already a pyramid scheme to begin with. But I think that goes into what you're saying, where like there's a giant gap in how people, I think we'll look back on pre-2020 and post-2020 as a big dividing line in
totally agree
how some of this stuff is played out.
Totally, that's a great point. It wasn't, the transition didn't exactly happen in COVID. It was a couple years after, right? It was after the first couple of years of lockdowns. But it's really the lockdowns. I watched it, my own kid, she was like 12 at the time, right? 12 to 14, and it destroyed her network. And when they would literally just get out of the house and go drink and do drugs and everything else because they were so, they couldn't see their friends. They couldn't go to school. They couldn't do anything. They were locked in the house. They've cut, the healthier ones have come out of that, and now they're not drinking, they're not doing drugs, they're healthy. And somebody else commented on this recently, but that they're not drinking very much, way less than my Gen X generation. We're an abnormality when it comes to that anyways, or maybe historically accurate. They're getting jobs, they're working, or younger, they're not paying attention to college. In fact, hardly any of them I'm hearing are thinking about college. Some are, but it's a fraction of what it used to be even 5 years ago. Now they want to go into the trades, and they want to go into first responders, and a lot of the stuff that you and I have spoken about before, and I spoke with Will. So on the other side was the question, right? So on the other side, your generation will be the young generation, just really getting into the workforce, or just starting the first promotions in the workforce. I'd like to see a lot more business ownership, like the trades, et cetera, like you and I have discussed in this transition. I'd rather not see that go to private equity and just get destroyed. I'd rather see that family offices step up and help kids, younger people in their area, buy out the older generation's going business and keep it in the community, right? Keep that business there instead of selling it off to some adjunct of
vultures and
Larry
parasites
Fink, right? Yeah. To just be destroyed in 5 years, because that's what happens, right? I watched the same thing with the leverage buyout days of the 80s, right? By the 90s, most 80% of those companies were already failing. So on the other side, if we can get through this, if we can survive this color revolution and stay whole, we're going to get and the culmination event of the constitutional crisis. And sorry, but those always come with blood, right? Those always come with gunfights. Those always come with some form of a civil war, right? If we can do that and survive that over the next several years, and not have a revolution, which there isn't strong enough organized force ideology on the other side for a revolution. It would be a collapse, right? And I don't know that it's possible, but if we can do this through the next 4 or 5 years, I don't think we get through this till mid part of the next decade. Then we'll plug up the holes in the Constitution that got us to this place over the last 80 years, 100 years. We'll have been able to deal with the debt issue and this massive government cost, parasitic overhead that we got called government at every level. That's going to require a fundamental jobs program, though, because that's what government is now. It's just a jobs program for retards, assholes, and malevolent estrogens, male and female, right? Not to say there isn't some good people in government. I don't mean to say that either, because there are, but
I think they're outnumbered and outgunned.
They are way outnumbered. Yeah, they're. What was that? I can't remember. There was a general in World War II surrounded, and he said, "Good, we got them just where we want them." Right. So I think we'll come out okay. We're going to have to go through some really hard times. There's going to be some struggles, but right now the first goalpost is let's not fail this loyalty test that allows them to succeed in the color revolution. And yes, right now there's a man in that office. He's in the executive. He's fully in and it's not loyalty to him, though, although we do need to be loyal to the executive, right? And the administration. It's loyalty to the Constitution, to our civilization, and to our, the citizens of this country. That's what we've got to remain loyal to. And don't let them convince us what that means, right? The second piece then is from that color revolution, what that's leading to is, the bloodletting that is the culmination of the constitutional crisis, right? And I'm guarantee you there's other constitutional gaps and holes that are going to have to be filled as well that I don't know about or haven't thought about. We'll get through that. That constitutional battles, right, normally take about 5 years. Okay, so when you get to, okay, we've survived the color revolution, we're still intact, now we're in a civil war. We get through parts of the Civil War, good portion of that. Then you sit down and start, so that's 3 to 5 years. And then you sit down and you get to the constitutional crisis and battling that out. And that's during the tail end of the Civil War, because that's all part of the same constitutional crisis. You work that out, that takes about 5 years. And then on the other side, there's a restoration, the restoration is in place. We've battled out all of these forces. We've removed the parasitism the best that we can. You can never fully remove it. We restore testosterones, and again, male and female, but a healthy, whole, logical system. And we drive on. And I think, quite honestly, if we can do it, culminating sometime mid to late part of the next decade, the best years of the United States are actually ahead. Why? Because we will be fully formed. We will have adjudicated out the reinstantiation of the English civilization that is the American Constitution in its purest form. We'll have cleaned up our messes. We'll have put people back in, put people into those positions that actually know what the hell they're doing. And more importantly, we will have pulled back from the empire. That process will also be finished, and we'll have done that as safely and securely as we can, right? Without leaving, threats to the core of the old empire out there in the periphery.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing to think about, the follow-up I have is like I'm in the same boat. I think the U.S. is probably I think it's basically the cleanest shirt and the dirty laundry, or however you want to put it. But I think when you look out past the next 5-10 years, some of these things that are going to shift with generations and different things that I think are coming, I'm also very optimistic about the US. I guess the follow-up question that I have is, do you think that like my long-term view is that we're eventually headed for a monarchy or a more centralized form of basically something that fits in with the way male hierarchies typically work, where you have
organic. So don't make it male, because really the females are the ones that actually dominate even in the testosterone system, but it's a organic status hierarchy, right? If we use the male, female, and all, what they do is they come and attack us with that. They because it's also not true. Organic status hierarchies are natural. They're nature. We see them everywhere, right? In nature. It's the artificial status hierarchies we have and the perverse incentive structures that are related to them.
Affirmative action, DEI, elevating all the mentally ill types. No, I think that's a good point, a good clarification. But my long picture view is, at some point in my lifetime, I think we're headed for a monarchy or something similar. I think that's the most natural form of government for humans.
But it'll be constitutional.
You think it'll be
a constitutional, and it'll. So we got to remember, we come out of a constitutional monarchical system created in 1688 through 1670 in 1680s or 1690s in the United Kingdom. And the president, the executive in the United States, really was given the constitutional monarchical powers, and then the separation of powers, which we did a better job of with the American Constitution than the various acts that collectively create the English Constitution. So I believe very much the Constitution will prevail. It will sustain. There will be greater clarifications in the as we come out of the constitutional crisis and the amendments, where there will be much more defined and much more defensible separations of power between the judiciary, the legislature, and the executive. There will also be greater capacity to remove, justices not acting in accordance with the Constitution, which we haven't done. I think there's been 13 judges removed since 17 whatever. I mean, it's ludicrous, right?
One every 20 years, give or take.
Right. The other piece, which I believe will be more clearly defined, is limitations on Congress's ability to do frivolous legal and all this other stuff, and a hard requirement upon them to actually carry out the duties of Congress to oversee the legislature, to oversee certain things, and to actually act upon them. In essence, what will happen is we will have a constitutional monarchical system, but not a hereditary monarchy. However, we do have a hereditary nobility already in the form of family offices, multi-generational family offices, multi-family, multi-generational family offices. For all intents and purposes, those are modern aristocracy, right? That's a modern feudalist system. The difference now is not that it's, the serfs working the land. It's where does that family, in whom and in what does that family have its capital at work through all their logic structure, so pulling away from the big funds and the big, and this is happening, by the way, already, right? And so that's the new fiefdom, is who and what that family office is invested in. And the hierarchy between the families within that multifamily family office, et cetera, that's feudalism. That's a feudalist state. I don't believe, now it may come about if it gets forced, right? If we get forced to it in the color revolution and the constitutional crisis, we might wind up with a monarch, a strong man with strong woman behind him, right? And strong women, and surrounded by strong men with their strong women behind him who had to take control. In which case, then maybe we do wind up with an actual more formal hereditary constitutional monarchy.
Yeah, I think the sooner the oligarch class, as you kind of put it, can discover or rediscover kind of the noblesse oblige part of their like what they should be doing, I think, instead of just chasing the next dollar or the next buck. I think that would be good for the society as a whole, because people talk about like the wealth concentration and some of these other things that are but basically put strain on the society. And I think you see that gap, and that's where I think a lot of the generational like shit fit, like basically food fight on social media, where you see people talking about, oh, like you got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and it's always interesting to see people. I've tried to avoid getting into that too much, because it's just a race to the bottom, really. But
no win situation.
Yeah, I think every generation has different challenges. I think there's certain things where as the boomers pass on, there's going to be a lot of changes that happen, and I think it'll be interesting to see where that goes. But I guess the next question I have, like, I'm kind of like I'm optimistic on the U.S., but as far as Europe and where I see that that basically Titanic heading for the iceberg, I think they're really kind of the odd man out, where you're going to have Russia as the center of gravity in Eastern Europe, China is the center of gravity in Asia, and then U.S. has influence over North and South America, and Europe doesn't have the resources, or it seems like the will or the capability to do much other than regulate and build bureaucracies and rules and all these different things. And it seems like they're pushing to kick things off in Ukraine and get more involved there. Like, if anyone looks at what happened with the drones and the strike against the Russian bombers,
that was part of the color revolution, by the way.
Well, that's the thing, is no one's going to convince me that was, this was all Ukraine and they designed this attack by themselves.
No.
Like, give me a
It's
break.
meant to discredit Trump in the eyes of the world leaders.
Yeah.
Part of the color revolution. Mm-hmm.
And that's the thing, where you look at stuff like that, people talk about World War III, say that we're already in it. I think part of the thing that's interesting with all these different events, like, you bounce from one thing to the next. Like, the whole Iran-Israel thing is definitely the most, like, interesting thing to watch going on right now. But part of me is always wondering, like, okay, if I'm watching this, am I taking my eye off the ball in another part of the world, whether it's like what's going on in Ukraine or some of these different things? But
it's all one continuum. So it's all related. It's all one continuum. It's
yeah,
all the outer edge of the empire, and the empire is pulling back. Two things. When you talk about monarchy, I believe Europe is returning to monarchy, straight up monarchy. Russia already has. Putin, for all intents and purposes, is a czar. Xi in China is an emperor. And they were elevated and sustained in those positions to fill those roles because it's the only way to fight against estrogen-based warfare of the West.
Mm-hmm.
It's the only way. Persia's already done it, right? And Iran was called, given that name not by the Persians, but by the British. They're Persian. It's the Persian Empire. So we're going back, and Erdogan, for all intents and purposes, is oh gosh, I forgot what the Ottoman monarch was called. Whatever. It's not called a caliph. I can't remember what he's called in Turkish. Those states, those ancient peoples, those civilizational peoples have already returned to basically monarchy. They've already had the aristocracy. Now it's all constitutional and it's all checks and balances and greatly updated, and that all needed to happen. I see Europe going back to, on the other side of this collapse. And there's already been conversations. I've heard whispers. Poland's already been talking to the old royal family. Romania has. Hungary, I know of some Habsburgs. I know some Habsburgs. There's conversations. So some of these conversations, I've talked to Charles Napoleon III, and so I know some of these conversations are happening. And of course, for me, being English and Scottish, I'm very interested in what's happening in the United Kingdom. And really, that's where I focus. I could give fuck all about Europe, to be quite honest. So Europe, I believe, is going back to monarchy first. And then I forgot what was the second thing you were saying there. I forgot.
Just kind of seeing where Europe heads. World War III.
Yeah. Okay.
Because it seems like the financial system and Europe specifically is like, I think the EU is headed for collapse in the next, basically by the end of the decade.
Collapsed. It's already collapsed.
What I'm saying, like,
it's just on momentum. Yeah.
That's the thing. By 2030, it'll be obvious,
and
the euro
if not
will
before.
be smoke, all that.
Yeah, if not before. So great. So first part is I do believe parts of Europe are going back to monarchy already, because it's going to be the only way that they're going to be able to, the competent who have understanding of competency going back centuries, because that's how they were raised from the time they were a child, are going to have to retake leadership positions, accountable leadership in their countries, and get rid of this liberal democracy that was fostered on them by the Venetians and the Dutch and then the British, right? With respect to the continuum of the conflict from Ukraine to Israel, etc., that's the empire the old empire pulling back.
As far as the connection from what's going on in Europe and the Middle East, and you said the empire pulling back, and you kind of see, it seems like to me that the U.S. is not interested in getting involved in like another drawn out conflict in the Middle East. But do you see the U.S. and the empire kind of pulling back from Israel as well, as far as, okay, we're not going to keep supporting your military with like all these bunker busters or bombs or other military equipment. We kind of need to focus on the home front more.
We pay for Israel's military across the board. I mean, there's billions of dollars in, state and military assistance aid that goes to Israel. So, people have said that Israel's the U.S. aircraft, the unsinkable aircraft carrier in the Middle East. Well, it is sinkable, and we're finding that out now as Iran striking it with missiles, and they haven't even used more than a few hypersonics yet, and they haven't even used some of the more advanced missiles yet. So I've said this several times, but for different reasons, and now I think it makes more sense to me that I don't think Israel survives as a state. I think it's tearing itself apart and dismantling itself. It's breaking itself. And I think we're doing everything that we can to keep that from going nuclear. But I don't, as the empire pulls back, there's, this is one little outpost on the opposite end of the Mediterranean from the opening. You can come through Suez, but that can get, you know what I mean? It's just like geologically, geographically, it's not defensible for an empire that's pulled back. That's a logistics chain on the other side of the world that has to go through, areas that are
multiple choke points.
It's just not feasible, right? And now with the Oreshniks and hypersonics that we can't shoot down and can't even really track, etc.
Yeah, or the Iron Dome, like that's not stopping those.
It's ludicrous. There's no such thing, right? So our sea power is not going to work anymore, right? We don't have the, they can take out a carrier fleet with a barrage of hypersonics. There's nothing we can do about it. So we don't have that force projection beyond our shores and our borders anymore. It's just not, that world has changed and it happens, right? It goes through this. So I don't see Israel as being defensible and supportable by the United States anymore. So then it's a matter of, well, how do we decouple and how do we pull back and how do we minimize the damage? Of course, they see that. Of course, they recognize that. And so, of course, they're going, they're, a member of the Five Eyes, the intelligence power block, the estrogens frickin' armies and, secret government. And so, of course, they're going all in to try and draw us into war with Iran and try and help set them up as the, the great power in the region, this greater Israel thing. But I'm sorry, Turkey's right there. Turkey's in Syria now. Turkey controls most of Syria. Turkey has the biggest army in NATO. And they're very knowledgeable and very experienced and very well armed, very well equipped, and they've been fighting for 20 years. They're not a paper army, not a paper military, and they've been dealing with insurgency and all this crap in the region, and they go back centuries there.
Yeah, and so, going back to what you were saying, he, I think the term is Sultan, the one you're looking
Sultan.
for.
Yes,
he's kind of, I think, probably views himself in that light and is looking for a path to kind of build Turkey back into the Ottoman Empire, or at least start to restore some of the former glory there. But the kind of last question I want to ask before wrapping up with some financial markets topics is kind of on the development of warfare. Like we've seen, like, okay, certain things are not really going to change, whether it's like the artillery and mass industrial scale in Eastern Europe. But some things definitely are changing. Like you see the drone technology and you see what's going on there. And that's one where China, at least for now, at least publicly, has a definite advantage. And they definitely have an advantage on the manufacturing side for drones specifically. But what do you kind of see moving forward as like the evolving technology landscape for warfare, for some of these different things? I think there's always going to be a place for like boots on the ground, like the old school stuff, because there's certain things you can't do without it. But what do you kind of see? How do you see technology evolving and advancing in kind of the military capabilities front?
We are coming back to a balance of power through force, back to testosterone. Testosterone's reality, right? Force on force, man on man, equipment on equipment, technology on technology. Yes, drones have fundamentally changed warfare, but not really. Not really. Still the same kind of warfare. You're still killing men, right? Cyber, okay, we're going to do cyber warfare. Okay, we have an entire division for massive investments in cyber. We didn't impede Russia's warfighting capacities one bit over the last 3 years using cyber, right? Yes, Israel just did disruption of Iran's systems, their air defense systems using cyber attack, but in 8 hours they had it back online, and they'll fix that gap, right? And it was some hacker that did it for them, that fixed it, just some hacker. which the US now put a $10 million freaking bounty on. Right? So this thought that we're going to go cyber, we're going to go high tech, we're going to, no. Yes, technologies advance in war. We've gone from sticks and stones to drones, but you will have a temporary, and Clausewitz talked about this 200 some odd years ago. You have a temporary advantage in the, in tactics and equipment and technology before your adversary adapts. And you have to make all of your progress in terms of ground taken, assets taken, whatever the hell is your war fighting, intent is. You have to actually succeed in that in the year to 2 years, and now it's accelerating, or in terms of getting smaller, the window in which you have that advantage. Well, it's failed. We just fought for 3 years in Russia with everything that we have, rapidly, evolving, changing, adapting. We lost, and we lost in a big way. So where are we now? Now we're back at a balance of forces. So what I see now in terms of the evolution is, how do we defend against these things? Because we obviously can't use them on the offense, right? As this, massive, sudden, capable thing. The reason is because we keep talking about innovation in the United States. We out innovate everybody. Sorry, motherfucker, but probably 60% of our engineers and scientists are from overseas. They're Chinese or Russian or Indian. Some of the engineers are Indian, but most of the scientists are Chinese or Russian, and the electrical engineers are Russians, and the mechanical engineers are Chinese. And, so it's like, shut the fuck up, right? To think that, and the Persians are brilliant at it, right? You have no idea how many Persian engineers I've worked with over the years, in software and hardware and electronics, and they're brilliant, right? So this whole concept and idea that, we're going to this isn't estrogens based thinking. It's unreal. We're going to out innovate them. Bitch, you don't have a fucking clue what innovation is, and you have no idea what warfare is. And we just found that out. So all of these advances in technologies and things we need to continue. We need to continue to adapt. But what I'm seeing now is the empire is pulling back, and it's inevitable. We can see this in other times in history, is the United States is no longer going to be an expeditionary force. It's going to go back to what it was originally designed for, and that we can do very well, and that's a defensive force for Fortress America. And that we can do very well, right? Now we got to deal with the issue in the north. So, I think we probably invade Canada over the summer and have it done by, hell, if we get started, we can just have it over by 4th of July. I say that tongue in cheek, but they're already breaking away. The states are, Canada's breaking up, right? It's just happening. Yeah. Give me a second. Then we got the issue with the southern border, right? Okay, well, we can deal with that. I mean, they keep talking about, I hear from the Mexican side that, they're going to retake all the old Mexican territories. I'm like, well, fuck, let's just go ahead and finish the Mexican-American War and take all of Mexico. Right? And I'm just saying, it's much easier for us to wage this kind of war here on our own turf and, our own continent, with an enemy that we know and terrain that we know, and an enemy that's cartels and flooding our country with drugs and weapons and violence and crime. It's like, we've got a casus belli against frickin' Mexico that goes back 30, 40 years. Way more of a casus belli than Iran or any of these other, Afghanistan, Iraq, frickin' Vietnam, all of them, right? So the illusion of technological superiority was crushed and destroyed on the plains of Ukraine. Period. And now whatever remaining illusion we have is being undone in Israel right now by Iran. And so what do? Right? The men get back in control, right? The testosterones, that's not just men, but the testosterones get back in control, and they reorient on protection, on defense, on safety and security, right here at home. But again, when you pull back the empire, you have to do it carefully. You have to expend all of those resources out there. Like we left $80 billion, $90 billion in Afghanistan. I guarantee you we did that on purpose to destabilize the region. And we're still paying them $40 million a week or a month or something. I think it's a week, right? We did that on purpose to have a destabilization against Iran, against Persia, in Persia's natural territories, its sphere of influence. It's all going to fail. Russia goes back to its sphere of influence. Turkey goes back to its sphere of influence. Iran, Persia goes back to its. China goes back to its. The United States pulls back to Monroe, and that's its sphere of influence. And that's what happens. Now, what happens to Europe? What happens to the British Isles? Again, the only area in the European area that I care about, right? I suspect that, you know, the United Kingdom, the British Isles are the homeland of our civilization, our people, and we're not going to let it fall. And I believe that very firmly. Now, how it plays out and how it happens and all of that, I don't know, right? I suspect very much there's going to be civil wars in Ireland. I don't know if it'll be civil war in Ireland. It might be more like the Troubles again, but just on a much bigger scale. But I do see civil war in the United Kingdom itself. And there are others, again, paying way more attention to that say that same thing. At some point, we'll get involved because these are our people, right? This is our family. And we can't, you know, let all that resource, the Commonwealth, et cetera, fall in the hands of our actual enemy, our ancient enemy, our only real enemy over the last 2,000 years, and that's Europe. So,
yeah, I think I mean, there's so many things going on, and it seems like also nothing's happening at the same time. But it's the back and forth between nothing ever happens, and yeah, it's pretty funny to watch. But I guess the last question as we start to wrap up here is I want to get like a big picture view of financial markets and maybe what you see happening there, because I know we've talked about some of the, like, we've had several conversations on this, but you think the basically the leverage in the system is going to create issues at some point, and there's going to be a move back to something more basic, not built on rehypothecation and not built on
financialism.
The hyper-financialization that you kind of see across the West. So I think that'd be a good place to kind of start to wrap up, is kind of big picture view on financial markets, whether it's commodities, stocks, bonds, anything else, real estate maybe. But yeah, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts there.
Yeah, so broad area and much better. I don't focus on it as much as I used to, but you have to, right? If you're going to pay attention to all 7 elements of power, you got to pay attention to economics and finance, right? 2 of the big domains. We have a collateral problem, and we can solve that collateral problem without selling our, national forest and, federal resources to investment firms. We can do it by going back local and small and building small, as you and I have talked about several times at length. There are 2 forms of solid collateral, right? Real hardcore, no shit collateral. One is resources in the various forms, natural resources in their various forms. And the United States, the North American continent, is rich in natural resources across the board. And again, I think we need to push back against the selling off of federal lands and all of that. Put it in a land trust, put it in the, sovereign wealth fund. Those are collateralized assets that we can do other sophisticated things with, but we don't need to, go and sell them to financialists who are just going to rape it and the state gets nothing real from it, or maybe a one-time payout.
One-time
right?
Sugar rush hit.
One-time sugar, yes. Let's not do that. Norway is the right example. Norway's done their sovereign wealth fund, I think, better than anybody else. And, well, turns out 30% of our civilization is built on the Dane law and Norwegian and Scandinavian concepts and ideas. So let's do that. But that's one form of collateral, and a lot of that is the commodities. And, as you know very well, and others talk it much better, but we are going back to commodity super cycle. That's just inevitable. And I think, however, moving forward, this commodity super cycle, as we back away from financialism, having come to its full extent where it bankrupts and enslaves everybody, I don't think until we forget what the hell we're doing in 100 years or so that we're going back to financialism. I think it's done. I think it's over. It's done. I think we're going to pay out the boomers on their retirements, and then financialism's done, right? And it's going to be a steady declining of that and a return to classical banking. And classical banking is actually solid and is necessary. And SOFR makes that possible, right? And that gets to the second form of collateral, which the banks, the regional and local banks, play a heavy part in. And that is, and as you and I talked about before, face to face, is we create collateral out of small companies and small to medium sized businesses in the local areas. And those are collateralized assets. Not that we're going to financialize, but you can lend against and you can borrow against. And what is the collateralized asset there? It's actual revenue streams, right? So SOFR allowed us not only to break from Europe, but allowed us to go back to a regional-based system here in the United States. It allows us to get back to classical banking, and the war that we're seeing playing out around the world is quite literally, and Tom Luongo talks this actually extraordinarily well, is a war between classical banking and financialism. And so financialists are failing. That's what this whole push, and another aspect of the whole push in Israel, Iran, and trying to take down Russia and et cetera, is their mad rush for collateral to keep the financialist Ponzi scheme going. That's, you know, in the English speaking world, 400 years on now. It can't be sustained. So that's what I think economically. So we go some form of sovereign wealth fund. I'm not a big fan of this Bitcoin thing. I suspect there's a very dangerous thing being set up for people who fall for it. But, you know, what do I know? I'm an older guy, but I've been hearing things from certain people about, anyways, I'll just leave it there. Basically about sovereign debts, right? And dumping it all on the crypto crowd who maybe aren't as clever as they think they are. Commodity super cycles, but I suspect that the value of actual proven reserves in the ground placed in sovereign wealth funds or in you know, holding company portfolios, et cetera, will be of substantially more value than they've been in a long time, right? And the good thing is, you know well, the mining companies have cleaned up their books over the last 40 years, I guess. And they're pretty good investments, you know, not all of them. And I don't pay attention to that. I have a friend of mine, Max Marmar, who does actually, younger guy like you. And then I think we create collateral, you know, so we should be doing a better job of helping the younger generation like you coming up to understand for stock companies and assets and asset portfolios and valuations, and, you know, more than just, you know, making a buck and borrowing some money. And it's no, how do you create a, you know, capital assets with what you're doing that then have greater value in the greater, you know, local system, and then maybe at the larger as well. And in the process of that, we create collateralizable assets.
Yeah, I think the hyper-financialization point and the way markets work now, I think that is not something that's built to last. So I think you're right that is going to change.
Yeah,
I think it's
that's the kill chain. Yeah.
I think it is interesting to kind of look at and see all these things happening at once, and some of these things that are set up to be very chaotic or already chaotic, depending on what you're talking about. And we didn't even really get into some of the health topics and some of the different things on birth control that we talked about in previous conversations. So I'll definitely have to have you back to talk about that, because that's one that's an area that I think is pretty interesting, and it's not something that a lot of people know about or are that familiar with, as far as how to stay healthy with some of the different things going on that are creating issues for that. But
That's where most all my focus is now, Ben, is, that World War III is happening, but it's happening in your cells, in your body. And the enemy isn't China, Russia, Iran, et cetera. It's the healthcare industry. And it's killing more every day than, every day and every year than all the wars in the world combined. World War III is playing out. It was declared with COVID. It's been going on before that, but the actual form of war was declared with COVID, and it's playing out in every cell in our bodies. And it's killing millions a year in our own countries. And so that's really, with the National Foundation for Integrative Medicine, the work I'm doing with Dr. Todd Ovakaitis and Dr. Dimitri and others, that's really where my emphasis is now. That's the real war. We have to win that war, right? We have to win that one.
Yeah, well, maybe we can do a quick turnaround on another appearance and maybe just talk about some of the health topics, because I think that'd be a super interesting podcast to get into. So, as far as starting to wrap up here, I do have to ask my traditional closing question again, which is, what book should I add to my reading list? I know listeners should all go check out your book called The Eternal War, but do you have another one that I should also add to the list?
I would highly recommend The Secret History of Mongol Queens. Right? Because, I keep getting attacked. I've had some unreal attacks here recently when I started talking estrogens and testosterones, which demonstrates, one, that I was right, and two, they really misunderstood. But The Secret History of the Mongol Queens articulates, and, again, please go read it. I think people should, that women have been the power of empire from the beginning, right? Men have their role in place. Testosterone has its role in, actual formal testosterone beings have their role in place. But the keepers of civilization, the keepers of the empire, are its matriarchs. And we need to get back to strong, healthy matriarchs who put in place, who get out of their genetic warfare, right? All out genetic warfare, and play smarter and change the incentive structures such that we can have healthy families and healthy relationships, and women can be healthy, right? Again, and not on antidepressants smelling like cat piss and boxed wine, right?
Yeah.
But
it is tough to see like the cat lady demographic and what's happening with antidepressant use and all these other different things
my heart. I'm a father of a daughter, right? I'm a girl dad, and it breaks my heart to see women like this. And I kind of like women.
Yeah,
right?
that's the healthy reaction, that's for sure. If my listeners want to find you or find more of your work, where can they look for you?
Yeah, emburlingame.substack.com is where I'm doing most of the writing. I've got a novel there we're serializing called As Rome Burns, where I go into a lot of this, particularly the matriarchy and an order of knights that's been protecting them for 800 years. And then, when I write a chapter, I think through stuff that's happening in the current world and how do we, weave those concepts in. I've done a lot of writing on Twitter. I'm taking a break from Twitter for a while because I'm just, I want to slap some people that I respect. It's like, come on, man. But I'm taking a break from Twitter for a while. Part of it's also to let my dopamine system recover. And, you got to take care of your own health, your own mental health, right? And so part of that. So Twitter, there's a lot of stuff on Twitter. That's EM Burlingame on Twitter. And then there's the emburlingame.substack.com. And those are probably the best places. And then The Art of Being a Man and The Eternal War and a couple other books are up on Amazon. Yeah,
I think it was a really interesting conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time to come on, and we'll definitely have to do it again, because I know we could talk for hours and hours. So I think with that, we'll be wrapping up. Thanks for stopping by, and we'll see you next time.